My name is Aaliyah Gray, and I'm 64 years old. If you think that means I'm finished fighting, you're about to discover just how wrong you can be. Sometimes the dead have one last gift to give, and sometimes that gift is the perfect weapon for revenge. The day of Richard's funeral dawned gray and cold, matching my mood as I stood before my bedroom mirror. I'd chosen my outfit carefully. A black Chanel suit that Richard had bought me during our marriage, my grandmother's pearl necklace, and matching earrings that caught the light when I moved. My long silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and despite my 64 years, I knew I still commanded attention when I entered a room. I needed that confidence today, because today I would be walking into enemy territory. Richard Gray, my ex-husband of 15 years, had died of a sudden heart attack at 66. We'd been divorced for a decade, but I'd loved that man for 30 years before his midlife crisis convinced him he needed a younger model. Lorraine Webb, 28 at the time, with bleached blonde hair and fake everything else, had been his secretary. Cliché doesn't begin to cover it. But I wasn't going to the funeral to mourn the man who'd broken my heart and left me for a woman half my age. I was going because, despite everything, Richard had been a part of my life for 3 decades. I deserved the right to say goodbye with dignity. What I got instead was the cruelest humiliation of my life. St. Mark's Episcopal Church was packed. Richard had been successful, a real estate developer who'd built half the upscale neighborhoods in our city. His death had made the front page of the business section, and it seemed everyone who'd ever done business with him was there to pay their respects. I slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the back. I'd hoped to remain unnoticed, to pay my respects and leave without drama. But Lorraine, now the grieving widow, had other plans. Oh my God, her voice carried across the church despite her attempt to whisper. What is that old hag doing here? Every head in the vicinity turned. Lorraine stood near the front of the church, draped in designer black like she was auditioning for a soap opera. Her children flanked her, Melissa, 34, in a power suit that screamed ambitious lawyer, and Brad, 31, looking bored and checking his phone during his stepfather's funeral. Mom, keep your voice down, Melissa hissed, but she was smirking as she said it. Why should I? Lorraine's voice got louder, more theatrical. She has no business being here. Richard divorced her years ago. She's just a bitter old woman who can't let go. The whispers started immediately. I felt hundreds of eyes on me, some curious, some pitying, some judgmental. My face burned with humiliation, but I kept my expression serene. I'd perfected that mask during the divorce proceedings. Never let them see you break. Brad laughed outright. Maybe she's hoping he left her something in his will. Good luck with that, lady. Dad couldn't stand you. The cruelty was breathtaking. Here I sat, trying to grieve a man I'd once loved deeply, and his new family was treating me like a joke, like an unwelcome intruder at my own past. Honestly, Lorraine continued, loud enough for half the church to hear, some people have no shame. She looks pathetic sitting there by herself. Richard always said she was desperate and clinging. My hands trembled slightly, but I clasped them in my lap and kept my chin up. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I would not let them drive me away. The service itself was a carefully orchestrated performance. Lorraine dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the devoted widow for all it was worth. Melissa gave a eulogy about Richard's second chance at happiness that was clearly aimed at me. Brad looked bored throughout, more interested in his phone than the proceedings. Not once did anyone mention Richard's first marriage, his first family, which had been me. 30 years of shared history, erased as if it had never existed. As people filed out after the service, the whispers continued. I caught fragments. That's his first wife. How embarrassing for her. Lorraine handled that well. She should have stayed home. I remained seated until the church was nearly empty, waiting for the crowd to disperse before making my exit. I had no desire to run another gauntlet of stares and whispers in the parking lot. That's when Samuel Kane approached me. Samuel had been Richard's lawyer for 20 years, a distinguished man in his 70s with kind eyes and silver hair. He'd handled our divorce with as much grace as such an ugly process allowed, and he'd always treated me with respect. "Mrs. Gray," he said quietly, settling into the pew beside me. "I'm glad you came." "I'm not sure anyone else shares that sentiment," I replied, my voice steady despite the humiliation still burning in my chest. "Richard would have wanted you here," Samuel said firmly. "Despite everything that happened between you two, he never forgot what you meant to him." I almost laughed at that. He had a funny way of showing it. Samuel reached into his briefcase and withdrew a cream-colored envelope with my name written on it in Richard's distinctive handwriting. "He asked me to give this to you after the service." He was very specific about the timing. I stared at the envelope, my heart racing. "What is it?" "I don't know. He sealed it himself and told me never to open it. But he made me promise to ensure you received it personally, away from—" He glanced toward the front of the church where Lorraine was still holding court with mourners, the others. My fingers shook slightly as I took the envelope. It was heavier than I'd expected, thick with whatever was inside. "He also wanted me to tell you something," Samuel continued. He said, "Tell Aaliyah that some debts can only be paid after death, and some truths can only be told when you have nothing left to lose." Before I could ask what that meant, Lorraine's voice cut through the church like a blade. "Samuel, there you are. We need to discuss the will reading. I trust there won't be any surprises." Samuel stood, his expression carefully neutral. "Of course, Mrs. Gray. We'll meet tomorrow at my office as scheduled." As he walked away, I was left alone with the envelope and a dozen questions. What debt? What truth? Why had Richard, who'd spent the last decade ignoring my existence, suddenly reached out from beyond the grave? I slipped the envelope into my purse and stood to leave. As I walked down the aisle, I passed Lorraine and her children one last time. They were too busy accepting condolences to notice me, but I heard Brad's voice as I passed. "At least the old bat's finally leaving. God, how pathetic can you get?" I kept walking, my head high, my steps steady. But inside, something cold and hard was forming. I'd spent 10 years trying to rebuild my life after Richard's betrayal. I'd found peace, if not happiness. I'd learned to live with the humiliation of being cast aside for a younger woman. But this public mockery at the funeral of a man I'd once loved, this was too much. I made it to my car before the tears came. Silent tears of rage and humiliation that streaked down my cheeks as I sat in the parking lot, watching Richard's friends and business associates file past my window without a glance. With shaking hands, I opened the envelope. Inside was a key. Small, brass, the kind that might fit a safety deposit box. There was also a handwritten note in Richard's careful script. "Aaliyah, if you're reading this, I'm dead, and you've just endured Lorraine and her children at their worst. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for a lot of things." The key opened safety deposit box 247 at First National Bank. Inside, you'll find documents that tell the truth about the family I chose over you. I spent 10 years learning who they really are, and I spent the last year documenting it. I was a fool to leave you for her. I was a bigger fool to believe that what we had was replaceable. But I was the biggest fool of all to think that time would erase what I'd done to you. I can't make amends now. But I can give you something I should have given you years ago, the truth. And with it, the power to decide what to do with that truth. They mocked you today. They called you pathetic, desperate, a relic. They're about to learn that some relics are more dangerous than they appear. Use this wisely, Aaliyah, or mercifully. The choice is yours. Richard. I read the note 3 times, my hands trembling more with each reading. A safety deposit box full of documents about Lorraine and her children. The truth about who they really were. I looked back at the church, where Lorraine was still playing the grieving widow, where Melissa was networking even at a funeral, where Brad was probably planning how to spend his inheritance. They'd called me an old hag. They'd said I was pathetic and desperate. They'd humiliated me in front of a church full of people who'd once respected me. For the first time since entering that church, I smiled. Some debts, Richard had said, could only be paid after death. Some truths could only be told when you had nothing left to lose. Well, Richard was dead, and I had everything to gain. I started my car and drove toward the bank, my mind already racing with possibilities. Whatever was in that safety deposit box, whatever truth Richard had uncovered, I was going to use it. Not in a courtroom, not in the media, but quietly, personally, methodically. They wanted to know what this old hag was doing at the funeral. They were about to find out. And by the time I was finished with them, they would regret every cruel word they'd spoken, every laugh at my expense, every moment they'd made me feel small and unwanted. Revenge, I was learning, was a dish best served from beyond the grave. Before we continue with Aaliyah's incredible journey of revenge, I want to share something important with you. If you've ever been told you're too old to start over, let me tell you, that's a lie. Your story isn't over, and you still have chapters left to write. Our best-selling book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, is filled with simple, powerful steps to help you heal, rebuild, and fall in love with life again. Click the link in the description box and start your new beginning today. Trust me, what Aaliyah discovers next will show you that it's never too late to reclaim your power. The safety deposit box sat before me like Pandora's box, small and innocent-looking, but I knew it contained something that would change everything. The bank manager had been accommodating when I presented the key and Richard's death certificate, though I caught her curious glance when she saw my name didn't match the current Mrs. Gray. "Take all the time you need, Mrs. Gray," she said, closing the private viewing room door behind her. I was alone with Richard's final gift. Inside the box was a thick manila folder, a smaller envelope marked personal, and a flash drive. My hands shook as I opened the folder and began to read. What I found was 10 years' worth of meticulous documentation. Bank statements, photographs, private investigator reports, recorded conversations. Richard had been systematically gathering evidence of his new family's true nature, and what he discovered was breathtaking in its scope. Lorraine, the grieving widow who'd just performed so beautifully at the funeral, had been embezzling from the Millbrook Children's Charity for 3 years. She served on their board and had access to donation accounts. The documents showed a pattern of transfers, small amounts at first, then increasingly larger sums, being moved from the charity's account to a personal account she'd hidden from Richard. $127,000 in total. Money meant to help underprivileged children, stolen to fund Lorraine's shopping addiction and cosmetic procedures. But that wasn't all. There were photographs, clearly taken by a private investigator, showing Lorraine in intimate situations with David Mitchell, Richard's former business partner. The affair had been going on for 2 years, continuing right up until Richard's death. Poor, devoted Lorraine, who just sobbed so convincingly over her husband's casket. Melissa's file was equally damning. Richard's stepdaughter, who'd given that touching eulogy about second chances, had been systematically embezzling from her law firm. She was a junior partner at Preston and Associates, and she'd been skimming client settlement funds for 18 months. The amounts were smaller than her mother's thefts, $43,000 over time, but in the legal world, stealing client money was career suicide. There were also documents showing that Melissa had been having an affair with the senior partner's husband. The firm was family-owned, and if the senior partner's wife discovered her husband's infidelity with a junior partner who was also embezzling, well, Melissa's legal career would be over in spectacular fashion. But Brad's file was perhaps the most devastating of all. Richard's stepson, who'd spent the funeral service on his phone like a bored teenager, had a gambling addiction that made his mother's shopping problem look quaint by comparison. The private investigators' reports detailed Brad's activities at underground poker games and illegal betting operations. He owed money to loan sharks, serious money. According to the most recent report, dated just a week before Richard's death, Brad was into Johnny Torino's organization for $89,000.
I knew that name.
Everyone in the city knew Johnny Torino's reputation. He wasn't the kind of man who accepted late payments or sad stories about cash flow problems. He was the kind of man who broke legs and worse when debts weren't paid. But here's the most interesting part. Brad thought he was about to inherit enough money from Richard to pay off his debts. He'd been bragging about it at the poker games, according to the surveillance reports. He'd even borrowed more money against his sure-thing inheritance. What Brad didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Richard had been considering changing his will. The documents included several draft versions, each one reducing their inheritance based on Richard's growing understanding of their true nature. The personal envelope contained a shorter note, but its contents hit me like a physical blow. Aaliyah, I know what I did to you was unforgivable. I convinced myself that leaving you was about finding happiness, but I know now it was about ego and fear. Fear of growing old, fear of becoming ordinary, fear of admitting that what we had was precious. You deserved better than what I gave you. You deserved faithfulness, respect, and love that didn't come with conditions or expiration dates. I can't undo the past, but I can give you the future. Not just the truth about them, but the power to decide what happens next. You were always the stronger one, Aaliyah. I was too proud to admit it then, but I see it clearly now. Whatever you decide to do with this information, I trust your judgment more than I ever trusted theirs. They think they've won. They think they're going to inherit everything and live happily ever after on money they didn't earn. They have no idea what's coming. Make them pay, Aaliyah. Not for me. I don't deserve that loyalty. Make them pay for what they did to you today and for what they do to people who can't fight back. Your ex-husband who never stopped loving you. Richard. I sat in that sterile bank room for an hour, reading and rereading the documents, letting their implications sink in. Richard hadn't just given me information. He'd given me weapons. Precise, devastating weapons aimed at the heart of each person who'd humiliated me today. Lorraine, who'd called me a desperate old hag, was herself a thief and an adulteress. Melissa, who'd smirked while her mother publicly humiliated me, was an embezzler sleeping with a married man. Brad, who'd laughed at my grief and called me pathetic, was a gambling addict in debt to dangerous criminals. And they all thought they were about to inherit Richard's fortune and live comfortably on the proceeds of their cruelty. I thought about the funeral, about the whispers and stares, about the way they'd treated me like an unwelcome intruder at my own history. I thought about 10 years of starting over, 10 years of rebuilding my life after being discarded for a younger model. They'd had their fun at my expense. Now it was my turn. But I wouldn't be hasty. Revenge, I was learning, was like a fine wine. It improved with careful planning and patience. I wouldn't expose them publicly or drag them through courts. That would be too quick, too clean. No, I would destroy them the way they destroyed me, slowly, personally, from the inside out. I would take away their security, their relationships, their peace of mind. I would make them understand what it felt like to be cornered and helpless. I would teach them that actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences come from the most unexpected sources. The old hag, indeed. As I gathered the documents and prepared to leave the bank, I realized I was smiling. For the first time in 10 years, I felt truly powerful. Not because of money or status or youth, but because I held the truth in my hands, and the truth was a weapon sharper than any sword. Lorraine and her children thought they'd humiliated a broken old woman today. What they'd actually done was awaken something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. I drove home to my modest apartment, so different from the house I'd shared with Richard, and spread the documents across my dining room table. I poured myself a glass of wine and began to plan. Phase 1 would target Brad, the weakest link. His gambling debts and his assumptions about his inheritance made him vulnerable. A few carefully placed phone calls, a few anonymous tips to the right people, and Brad's world would crumble. Phase 2 would focus on Melissa. Her career, her reputation, her sense of invincibility, all of it built on stolen money and borrowed time. Phase 3 would be Lorraine herself, the widow who thought she'd won the ultimate prize by burying her husband and inheriting his legacy. By the time I was finished with them, they would understand exactly what kind of woman they'd mocked today. They would learn that some people, particularly women who'd survived being cast aside and rebuilt their lives from nothing, were not as helpless as they appeared. They wanted to know what this old hag was doing at the funeral? I was collecting my inheritance. Not money. Something far more valuable. I was collecting justice. And unlike their ill-gotten gains, my justice would compound with interest. 3 days after the funeral, I began my work on Brad Gray. Of all Richard's stepchildren, he was the most vulnerable, the most arrogant, and the most deserving of what was coming to him. I'd spent those 3 days gathering additional intelligence through my own private investigator, Clara Moore. Clara and I had been friends since college, and she'd started her own investigation firm after a career in law enforcement. She was discreet, thorough, and she understood the value of patience when building a case. Brad Gray is a walking disaster, Clara reported as we sat in my living room, reviewing her findings. He's not just gambling, he's gambling badly. Underground poker, illegal sports betting, even some high-stakes private games in hotel suites. He's lost $127,000 in the past 18 months alone. But he owes $89,000 to Torino's organization? That's what he owes currently. He's paid off some debts by borrowing from other sources. It's like a pyramid scheme of debt. He's been telling everyone that his inheritance will solve all his problems. I smiled grimly. And what exactly does he think he's inheriting? Clara consulted her notes. He's been bragging that Richard left him at least $500,000. He's already made promises to several creditors based on that assumption. In fact, he borrowed another $25,000 last week specifically because he told them the money was coming any day now.
Perfect.
Brad had built his house of cards on assumptions about money that might not even exist. Richard's final will reading wasn't scheduled for another week, but I had no intention of waiting that long to begin Brad's education and consequences. My plan was elegantly simple. Brad's creditors, particularly Johnny Torino's people, thought they were waiting for a guaranteed payday. What they didn't know was that their debtor was living in a fantasy. I made my first call from a burner phone, altering my voice to sound like a concerned neighbor. Is this the number for Johnny Torino's organization? I have information about Brad Gray. 20 minutes later, I'd planted the seeds of doubt about Brad's upcoming inheritance. Not lies exactly, just questions. Had anyone verified that Brad was actually inheriting what he claimed? Had anyone seen proof of his expectations? Wouldn't it be wise to collect what they could now, before the will reading revealed any surprises? The second call went to the private poker game organizer. Again, just friendly concern about extending credit to someone whose financial situation might not be as stable as he claimed. The third call was to the sports book where Brad had been placing increasingly desperate bets, doubling down on losses in the classic pattern of addictive gambling. I didn't make accusations. I didn't provide false information. I simply raised questions about the wisdom of extending further credit to someone whose inheritance claims were unverified. By Friday morning, Brad's world had begun to shift in ways he didn't yet understand. Clara called me at noon with an update. It's starting. Torino's people visited Brad at his apartment last night. Friendly conversation, but they wanted to discuss payment schedules and verification of assets. He's been calling Richard's lawyer all morning, demanding an immediate will reading. And Samuel Kane's response? He's sticking to the scheduled date next Tuesday. He told Brad that legal procedures can't be rushed, even for emergency financial planning. I could picture Brad's growing panic. He'd borrowed money against expectations that were looking less certain by the hour. His creditors were asking uncomfortable questions, and he had no way to verify his inheritance claims without seeming desperate. The weekend brought more pressure. The poker game organizer called Brad to regretfully inform him that his credit had been suspended pending verification of his financial status. The sports book imposed a similar restriction. And on Sunday evening, Brad received another visit from Torino's organization, this one less friendly than the last. Clara's surveillance photos showed Brad leaving his apartment building Sunday night looking haggard and frightened. He'd aged 5 years in 5 days. Monday morning, I made my final move. I called the loan shark who'd advanced Brad the recent $25,000, again using the untraceable phone and altered voice. I'm calling about Brad Gray, I said. I thought you should know. I just saw his stepfather's lawyer, and there might be some issues with the inheritance he's been promising you. What kind of issues? The kind where there might not be as much money as Brad thinks. The lawyer seemed concerned about unrealistic expectations and family members who haven't been fully informed about the estate's actual value. I hung up before the conversation could go further. I'd planted the seed. Others would water it with their own fears and greed. By Monday afternoon, Brad was in full panic mode. He'd called Samuel Kane 17 times, according to Clara's contact at the lawyer's office. He'd also called Lorraine and Melissa, desperately trying to get information about Richard's assets and estate planning. But here was the beautiful part. Nobody knew what Richard had actually left behind. He'd been secretive about his finances in his final years, trusting only Samuel Kane with the details. For all they knew, Richard could have died broke, or changed his will, or donated everything to charity. The uncertainty was eating Brad alive, and his creditors were growing more impatient by the hour. Tuesday morning, the day of the will reading, Clara called with the news I'd been hoping for. Brad's apartment was ransacked last night. Torino's people, almost certainly. They didn't hurt him, but they made their point. He's got 48 hours to produce payment or alternative arrangements will be made. What kind of alternative arrangements? The kind that involve hospital visits and broken bones. Brad is scared out of his mind. He's been calling everyone he knows, trying to borrow money to buy time until the will reading. I felt no sympathy for him. This was the same man who'd laughed at my grief, who'd called me pathetic while I tried to say goodbye to someone I'd loved for 30 years. He was learning what it felt like to be desperate, cornered, with nowhere to turn. But I wasn't finished with him yet. Tuesday afternoon, Samuel Kane's office would reveal that Brad's inheritance was far less than he'd promised his creditors. The exact amount didn't matter. What mattered was that it wouldn't be enough to cover his debts, especially not after taxes and legal fees. And when that news reached his creditors, Brad would discover that his promises had been more binding than any legal contract. Men like Johnny Torino didn't care about probate procedures or tax implications. They cared about being paid as promised when promised. Brad Gray had mocked me for being an old woman clinging to the past. By evening, he would be a desperate young man with no future at all. That was just the beginning of his education and consequences. As I prepared to attend the will reading myself, Samuel had invited me as a witness to certain provisions. I reflected on how quickly fortunes could change. A week ago, Brad had been smugly confident about his financial future. Today, he was terrified and running out of options. But this was only the first movement in a longer symphony of revenge. Brad's downfall would serve as a warning to his mother and sister, though they wouldn't recognize it as such until it was too late. They'd all learn, eventually, that the old hag they'd mocked at the funeral was more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. Some lessons, after all, are best learned the hard way. The will reading was a masterpiece of legal theater, and I had a front row seat to watch Lorraine's family discover the difference between expectation and reality. Samuel Kane's office was decorated in the kind of subdued elegance that spoke of old money and established reputation. Lorraine arrived first, dressed in black as if she were still performing the grieving widow role. She wore a new diamond bracelet I didn't remember from the funeral, probably an early celebration purchase. Melissa followed, crisp and professional in a tailored suit that had probably cost more than most people made in a month. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for her actions. Brad was the last to arrive, and the change in him was striking. The cocky young man from the funeral had been replaced by someone hollow-eyed and nervous. He kept checking his phone, and I noticed his hands trembling slightly when he reached for the water Samuel's assistant offered. I sat quietly in the corner, officially present as a witness to certain provisions Richard had made regarding our shared assets from our marriage. Unofficially, I was there to watch their world crumble. Samuel began reading the will in his measured, professional tone. The opening sections were standard: charitable donations, bequests to longtime employees, payments to various organizations Richard had supported. Then came the family provisions. To my stepson Brad Gray, I leave the sum of $50,000, with the condition that it be used exclusively for debt reduction and professional counseling for gambling addiction. Brad's face went white. $50,000. Not the $500,000 he'd been promising his creditors. Not enough to cover his current debts, let alone the additional money he'd borrowed in anticipation of a larger inheritance. To my stepdaughter Melissa Gray, I leave the sum of $75,000, with the condition that it be placed in a trust and distributed over 5 years to prevent any impulsive financial decisions. Melissa's confident expression cracked slightly. $75,000 over 5 years meant $15,000 per year, not enough to maintain her expensive lifestyle, and certainly not enough to pay back the money she'd embezzled from her law firm. To my beloved wife Lorraine Gray, I leave the remainder of my estate, including the family home, with the following conditions. Lorraine's relief was palpable. She would still inherit the bulk of Richard's wealth. But as Samuel continued reading, her expression began to change. These bequests are contingent upon the successful completion of financial audits of all beneficiaries, to be conducted by an independent accounting firm. Should any beneficiary be found to have engaged in illegal financial activities, their inheritance will be forfeited and donated to charity. The silence in the room was deafening. Samuel continued reading additional provisions, requirements for annual financial reporting, restrictions on large expenditures, oversight committees. Richard had essentially placed his entire family under financial surveillance from beyond the grave. After the reading, Lorraine cornered Samuel while Melissa tried to calm a visibly panicking Brad. Financial audits? Lorraine's voice was strained. What does that mean exactly? It means that independent accountants will review all of your financial records for the past 5 years, Samuel explained calmly. Bank accounts, investments, business dealings, charitable activities. Standard procedure for estates of this size, really. I watched Lorraine's face cycle through emotions: confusion, fear, anger, and finally calculation. She was trying to figure out how much Richard had known and how much she could hide before the audits began. How long do these audits take? Melissa asked, her lawyer's training kicking in even as her world tilted. Several months, typically. The accounting firm Richard specified is very thorough. They'll want to examine everything. Brad excused himself to make a phone call, but I could see him pacing frantically outside the office windows. He had less than 24 hours to satisfy Johnny Torino's organization, and his inheritance wouldn't even cover half of what he owed. After the family left, Samuel turned to me with a slight smile. "Richard's final gift to you," he said quietly. He knew about their activities. The audit provision ensures that none of them will actually inherit anything substantial. And if they refuse the audits, then they forfeit their inheritances entirely. Richard was very specific about that. I left Samuel's office feeling deeply satisfied. Richard's final will was more elegant than any revenge I could have planned myself. But I wasn't about to stop there. The audit provision would eventually destroy them all, but that would take months. I preferred more immediate consequences. My campaign against Melissa began that very evening. Clara had done excellent work infiltrating Melissa's social and professional circles. Melissa was a junior partner at Preston and Associates, engaged to David Preston Jr., the senior partner's son and heir to the firm. She'd built her entire life around the assumption that she would eventually become the firm's queen, managing both the business and the family behind it. What the Preston family didn't know was that their future daughter-in-law was not only embezzling client funds, but also having an affair with David Sr., her fiancé's father. I'd studied the evidence Richard had gathered. Photos of Melissa and David Sr. at hotels. Credit card records showing expensive gifts. Email exchanges that were explicit in their intimacy. But I wouldn't simply dump this information on the family. That would be too crude, too obvious. Instead, I would create a situation where they discovered the truth themselves. I started with Sarah Preston, David Sr.'s wife, and the true power behind the family firm. Sarah was old money, socially connected, and fiercely protective of her family's reputation. She also volunteered extensively with various charitable organizations around the city. "Mrs. Preston? This is Margaret Williams from the City Charity Oversight Committee," I said, using a false name and a professionally neutral tone. "I'm calling because your name came up in connection with some concerns about attorney ethics and charitable fund management." "I'm sorry, what concerns?" "We've received an anonymous report suggesting that someone at your family's firm might be mishandling client settlement funds that were meant for charitable donations. We're required to investigate any such allegations." Sarah's voice became immediately sharp. "Are you accusing my family's firm of impropriety?" "Not at all, Mrs. Preston. But we do need to verify that all charitable donations and client settlements have been properly handled." The report specifically mentioned concerns about junior partners and their access to settlement accounts. I provided just enough detail to point suspicion toward Melissa without making specific accusations. Then I hung up and waited. Sarah Preston was exactly the kind of woman who would investigate quietly and thoroughly before making any decisions. Within 48 hours, she would have discovered evidence of Melissa's embezzlement. And once she started digging into Melissa's activities, she would inevitably discover the affair. Meanwhile, I planted similar seeds of doubt at the charity organizations where Melissa served on volunteer boards. Anonymous tips about potential financial irregularities. Suggestions that someone should verify the accuracy of donation records. Questions about whether junior law partners should have access to charitable funds. By Thursday, 3 separate organizations had quietly begun reviewing their financial relationships with Preston and Associates. By Friday, Sarah Preston had hired a private forensic accountant to examine the firm's client settlement procedures. Melissa had no idea that her world was being systematically dismantled by investigators and auditors who thought they were simply being prudent about financial oversight. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected direction. David Jr., Melissa's fiancé, was planning to surprise her with an early anniversary dinner at the Meridian Hotel, the same hotel where Richard's private investigator had photographed her with David Sr. I made sure David Jr. would arrive at exactly the right moment. A simple anonymous tip to his assistant, David Jr. Might want to check the Meridian Hotel bar Friday evening around 7. His fiancée has been meeting someone there regularly. The assistant, thinking she was helping prevent an unpleasant surprise, mentioned to David Jr. that someone had seen Melissa at the Meridian with another man. She suggested he might want to investigate before rumors started spreading. David Jr., confident in his relationship but curious about the claim, decided to surprise Melissa at the hotel. He arrived at 7:15 p.m. to find his fiancée in an intimate booth with his own father, their hands intertwined across the table, sharing a kiss that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Clara's contact at the hotel described the scene that followed as spectacular in its destruction. David Jr. confronted them immediately, his voice carrying across the restaurant as he accused his father of betrayal and his fiancée of being a scheming, lying whore. The entire confrontation was witnessed by at least 30 other diners, including several prominent members of the legal community who knew all the parties involved. By Sunday morning, the story was circulating through every law firm, country club, and social organization in the city. But that was only the beginning of Melissa's problems. Sarah Preston, armed with the forensic accountant's preliminary findings, confronted her husband Monday morning. The accountant had discovered $43,000 in missing client settlement funds, all traced back to Melissa's management of specific cases. The family meeting that followed was described to me in vivid detail by Clara's source inside the Preston household, a longtime housekeeper who'd witnessed decades of family drama but had never seen anything quite like this. Sarah Preston stripped Melissa of her partnership, her access to all firm accounts, and her position on every charitable board the family influenced. She also made it clear that any attempt by Melissa to practice law in the city would be met with vigorous opposition from one of the region's most powerful legal families. But perhaps most devastatingly, Sarah made sure that Melissa's professional destruction was very public. She called colleagues at other firms, informing them that Preston and Associates would no longer recommend Melissa Gray for any positions due to ethical concerns and financial irregularities. In the legal community, such a statement was career suicide. No reputable firm would touch Melissa after that. By Wednesday of that week, exactly 10 days after she'd smirked while her mother called me an old hag, Melissa Gray was unemployed, unemployable, and socially ostracized from every circle she'd ever inhabited. She tried, of course, to salvage something from the wreckage. She called former colleagues, old law school friends, and even contacted firms in other cities. But Sarah Preston's reach was extensive, and word traveled fast in legal circles. Melissa Gray was damaged goods, tainted by embezzlement and adultery scandals that made her toxic to any respectable practice. I watched her final humiliation from across the street at a coffee shop where I'd positioned myself to observe. Melissa emerged from the Preston and Associates building carrying a single cardboard box, the sum total of her professional possessions. Her designer suit looked expensive, but her face told the real story. She looked lost, confused, like someone who'd just discovered that concept. I watched her final humiliation from across the street at a coffee shop where I'd positioned myself to observe. Melissa emerged from the Preston and Associates building carrying a single cardboard box, the sum total of her professional possessions. Her designer suit looked expensive, but her face told the real story. She looked lost, confused, like someone who'd just discovered that consequences were real and permanent. As she loaded her box into her car, a BMW that would probably be repossessed within the month, I felt a deep satisfaction. This was the woman who'd given a touching eulogy about second chances, while planning to destroy my reputation. She'd stood next to her mother and laughed while I was publicly humiliated at my ex-husband's funeral. Now she was learning what real humiliation felt like. The beautiful irony was that Melissa had destroyed herself. Her own choices, the embezzlement, the affair, the arrogance, had created the weapons I'd used against her. I'd simply made sure those weapons found their targets. But Melissa's downfall was more than personal satisfaction. It was also a strategic move in a larger game. Her public disgrace would weaken Lorraine's position in society, and Brad's growing desperation would make him even more vulnerable to pressure. The family that had mocked me as a pathetic old woman was systematically destroying itself, and I was orchestrating every movement of their downfall. As I watched Melissa drive away from her former life, I smiled and raised my coffee cup in a small toast. 2 down. 1 to go. Lorraine Gray had always been a woman who believed her beauty and charm could overcome any obstacle. At 58, she'd maintained her appearance through expensive procedures and treatments, and she wielded her sexuality like a weapon in business and social situations. She'd stolen my husband, inherited his wealth, and humiliated me at his funeral. She was about to learn that some weapons cut both ways. The audit provision in Richard's will had terrified her, but Lorraine was a clever woman. She'd immediately begun covering her tracks, moving money, destroying records, and preparing explanations for any irregularities the auditors might discover. What she didn't know was that I had no intention of waiting for the auditors to find her crimes. I was going to expose them myself, strategically and devastatingly. My campaign against Lorraine began with her greatest vulnerability, her affair with David Mitchell, Richard's former business partner. Richard's private investigator had documented their relationship extensively, but I needed more recent intelligence to make my attack precise. Clara's surveillance revealed that Lorraine and David were still meeting regularly, even after Richard's death. In fact, their relationship had intensified. They were making plans. Plans that involved David leaving his wife and Lorraine selling Richard's assets, so they could start fresh together somewhere warm and tropical. The irony was perfect. Lorraine had destroyed my marriage by seducing my husband, and now she was planning to destroy her inheritance by running away with another married man. I decided to let her destroy herself, with just a little strategic assistance. My first move targeted the Millbrook Children's Charity, where Lorraine served as board treasurer and had been systematically embezzling donations. The charity's board was composed of wealthy, socially prominent women who took their philanthropic duties seriously. They would not react well to discovering that one of their own had been stealing from underprivileged children. I called Margaret Thornfield, the charity's board president, using my real name this time. Margaret, this is Aaliyah Gray. We met several times during charity events when I was married to Richard. Aaliyah. I was so sorry to hear about Richard's passing. How are you holding up? I'm managing, thank you. But I'm calling because I've discovered something troubling that I thought you should know about. It concerns the charity's finances. I explained that while reviewing some of Richard's papers, I'd found documents suggesting irregularities in the charity's account management. I didn't accuse Lorraine directly. I simply raised concerns about oversight and suggested that an independent audit might be prudent. Margaret thanked me for bringing the matter to her attention and promised to investigate immediately. Within 24 hours, the charity had hired a forensic accountant to review all financial transactions from the past 3 years. Lorraine's embezzlement was sophisticated but not undetectable. She'd been careful about amounts and timing, but she'd left a trail that professional investigators could follow. While the charity investigation proceeded, I moved to my second target. David Mitchell's wife, Catherine. Catherine Mitchell was everything Lorraine was not. Genuinely elegant, quietly intelligent, and respected throughout the community for her charitable work and family devotion. She'd been married to David for 32 years and had no idea her husband was planning to abandon her for Richard's widow. I couldn't simply tell Catherine about the affair. That would be too obvious and potentially traceable back to me. Instead, I needed her to discover it naturally, in a way that would maximize the emotional impact and social consequences. I arranged for Catherine to discover the truth through her own social circle. Using information from Clara's surveillance, I learned that David and Lorraine had been meeting at the country club every Wednesday afternoon, supposedly to discuss business matters related to Richard's estate. They were always very discreet, but their body language and intimate conversations were obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. I made sure Catherine would be at the country club next Wednesday. Catherine, this is Aaliyah Gray. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. Aaliyah, what a pleasant surprise. I've been meaning to call you since Richard's funeral. How are you? I'm doing well, thank you. I was wondering if you might join me for lunch at the country club this Wednesday. I've been rather isolated since the funeral, and I could use some friendly conversation. Catherine graciously accepted, and we arranged to meet at noon, exactly when David and Lorraine would be having their weekly business meeting, at a corner table they thought was private. Wednesday arrived with perfect weather, and Catherine and I enjoyed a lovely lunch on the terrace overlooking the golf course. I guided our conversation toward topics that required us to move around the club, visiting the ladies' lounge, checking the bulletin board for upcoming events, touring the recently renovated dining rooms. Our tour naturally took us past the corner table where David and Lorraine were deep in intimate conversation. Their hands were intertwined across the table, and David was stroking Lorraine's arm while she leaned close to whisper something that made him smile. Catherine saw them immediately, and I watched her face cycle through confusion, recognition, and finally devastation as she understood what she was witnessing. I think I should go, she said quietly, her voice barely steady. Of course, I replied gently. Would you like me to drive you home? She nodded, unable to speak. As we left the club, Catherine broke down completely. 32 years of marriage, destroyed by a woman who specialized in stealing other women's husbands. The pain in her voice was heartbreaking, and I felt genuine sympathy for her. She was an innocent victim in Lorraine's pattern of destruction. But Catherine was also a woman with extensive social connections and a reputation for discretion and honesty. When someone like Catherine Mitchell discovered adultery, the news spread through the community like wildfire, but in the form of concerned whispers rather than malicious gossip. By Thursday evening, everyone in Lorraine's social circle knew about the affair. The response was swift and decisive. Lorraine was quietly removed from 3 charity boards. Her invitations to social events began to disappear. Her hairdresser, her personal trainer, and even her housekeeper found reasons to terminate their services, all of them unwilling to be associated with a woman who destroyed a respected family's marriage. The social exile was devastating for someone like Lorraine, whose entire identity was built around her position in the community. But it was only the beginning of her troubles. Friday morning brought news that the Children's Charity Audit had discovered $127,000 in missing funds, all traced to accounts Lorraine controlled. The charity board, led by the furious Margaret Thornfield, had decided to pursue criminal charges. Saturday brought David Mitchell's decision to end their affair rather than face divorce proceedings that would destroy his business reputation and financial future. When pressured to choose between his lover and his livelihood, David chose pragmatically. By Sunday, Lorraine Gray, the woman who'd publicly called me a desperate old hag, was facing criminal charges, social ostracism, and romantic abandonment. But I still wasn't finished with her. Monday morning, I made one final call, this time to Detective Harris at the Financial Crimes Unit. Detective Harris, this is Aaliyah Gray. I believe Margaret Thornfield from the Millbrook Children's Charity has already spoken with you about some missing funds. Yes, ma'am. We're investigating those allegations. I thought you should know that I've discovered additional evidence that might be relevant to your investigation. Financial documents that suggest the charity theft might be part of a larger pattern of embezzlement. I provided Detective Harris with copies of the evidence Richard had gathered, not all of it, just enough to expand the investigation beyond the charity. I also mentioned that Richard's estate audit had raised questions about other financial irregularities that might warrant law enforcement attention. By Wednesday, Lorraine's house was being searched by police officers carrying warrants for financial records. Her bank accounts were frozen pending investigation. Her lawyer was advising her to prepare for multiple felony charges. The woman who'd thought she'd won everything by burying my ex-husband was now losing everything while he was barely cold in his grave. I watched from my car as Lorraine was led from her house in handcuffs. She looked older, smaller, diminished by the weight of consequences she'd never expected to face. The beautiful, confident woman who'd stolen my husband and mocked my grief was gone, replaced by someone who looked frightened and utterly alone. As the police car pulled away, I felt a deep satisfaction settle in my chest. Lorraine had destroyed my marriage, humiliated me publicly, and stolen money meant for children in need. Now she would spend years in prison thinking about the choices that had brought her to this moment. But perhaps the most fitting punishment was that she would face those consequences without the man she'd destroyed 2 marriages to possess. David Mitchell had abandoned her the moment her troubles became inconvenient for him, proving that the love she'd thought was worth destroying my life for was nothing more than selfish convenience. 3 weeks after Richard's funeral, his new family had been completely destroyed. Brad was hiding from creditors who wanted to break his legs. Melissa was unemployable and socially ostracized. Lorraine was facing years in prison for embezzling from children's charities. The old hag they'd mocked had systematically dismantled their lives using nothing more than the truth about who they really were. Justice, I reflected, was indeed beautiful when it was properly served. If you're watching this story unfold and feeling inspired by Aaliyah's transformation from victim to victor, you're not alone. Life has a way of knocking us down, but how we choose to get back up, that's what defines us. Our book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, isn't just about recovery. It's about becoming stronger, wiser, and more powerful than you ever thought possible. Don't let anyone convince you that your best days are behind you. Click the link below and discover how to turn your pain into power, just like Aaliyah did. With Lorraine in custody, Melissa unemployable, and Brad in hiding from loan sharks, I thought my revenge was complete. But as I sat in my modest apartment 3 weeks after the funeral, I realized there was one more piece of justice that needed to be claimed: the house. Richard's house, our house really, since I'd helped him design and build it 25 years ago, stood empty now. Lorraine's arrest had triggered the estate's asset protection protocols, freezing most of the inheritance pending resolution of the criminal charges. The beautiful Georgian colonial on Maple Hill Drive, with its marble foyer and the garden I'd planned, sat vacant while lawyers sorted through the wreckage of Richard's final will. I'd driven past it several times since Lorraine's arrest, each visit bringing back memories of the life I'd built there. The kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals. The master bedroom where I'd nursed Richard through pneumonia. The living room where we'd entertained friends and planned our future. Lorraine had redecorated everything, of course, erasing all traces of my presence. But the bones of the house remained the same, the layout I'd insisted on, the windows I'd positioned to capture the morning light, the reading nook I designed for quiet afternoons. That house should have been my sanctuary in my later years. Instead, it had become Lorraine's trophy, a symbol of her victory over the first wife. She'd flaunted it at dinner parties, often mentioning how much better the house felt without my dreary influence. Now it sat empty, and I found myself wondering what would happen to it. The answer came from an unexpected source. Samuel Kane called me on a Thursday morning with news that changed everything. "Aaliyah, I need to discuss something with you regarding Richard's estate. Could you come to my office this afternoon?" "Of course." "Is this about the criminal proceedings?" "It's about the house, actually. There's a provision in Richard's will that I haven't discussed with anyone yet on his specific instructions. He wanted me to wait until certain circumstances arose." I was intrigued. "What kind of provision?" "I'd rather explain in person. Can you come at 2 o'clock? Samuel's office felt different this time. less formal, more personal. He offered me tea and settled into the chair across from me with the careful manner of someone about to deliver significant news. Aaliyah, I want you to know that Richard spoke about you often in his final years. He never stopped feeling guilty about how your marriage ended. Samuel, I appreciate that, but please let me finish. Richard's will contains a provision that I've been instructed to reveal only if Lorraine was ever charged with a crime or if she attempted to sell the house within 5 years of his death. My heart started beating faster. What kind of provision? Samuel opened a file and withdrew a legal document I'd never seen before. In 2018, Richard quietly transferred ownership of the house to a trust. The trust's beneficiary is listed as the person who truly made that house a home. I don't understand. The trust document specifically names you, Aaliyah, as the sole beneficiary. Lorraine has been living in a house she never actually owned. She thought she was inheriting it, but legally, it's been yours for the past 5 years. I stared at him, unable to process what I was hearing. That's impossible. Richard divorced me. He married her. Why would he? Because he never stopped believing that house belonged to you. You designed it, you built it with him, you made it what it was. In his words, Lorraine may have lived there, but Aaliyah created it. Samuel handed me the trust documents, and I read them with growing amazement. Richard had set up an elaborate legal structure that protected the house from his new wife's claims while ensuring it would eventually return to me. The trust had been paying all maintenance costs, taxes, and utilities for 5 years. Money that Lorraine thought was coming from Richard's other accounts. Why didn't he tell me? He was ashamed. He knew he'd hurt you badly, and he was afraid you'd see this as manipulation or guilt rather than justice. He wanted to make sure it only came to light if Lorraine proved herself unworthy of the life he'd given her. I sat in silence, absorbing the implications. The house was mine. Legally, officially, completely mine. Lorraine had never owned it, despite living there for 8 years. She'd been nothing more than a tenant, and now her lease was up. What happens next? That's up to you. The house is yours to do with as you please. You could sell it, rent it, move into it yourself. Lorraine has 30 days to remove her personal belongings, but she has no legal claim to the property itself. I drove to Maple Hill Drive that afternoon and parked across the street from my house. For the first time in 10 years, I looked at it not as a symbol of my lost life, but as my actual home. The gardens needed work. Lorraine had neglected the plantings I'd carefully selected. The shutters needed painting. The driveway had cracks that should be repaired. But underneath the surface neglect, I could see the house I designed and loved. I called Clara that evening. I need a favor, I said. I want to know everything about what Lorraine left behind in the house. And I want to know what happened to Brad and Melissa since their mother's arrest. Clara's investigation revealed a satisfying picture of complete collapse. Brad had fled the city entirely after Johnny Torino's organization made it clear that his mother's legal troubles didn't absolve him of his gambling debts. He was last seen in a cheap motel 3 states away, using a false name and working as a dishwasher in a truck stop diner. Melissa had moved in with a former law school friend in another city, sleeping on a couch and working at a call center while trying to rebuild her life under an assumed name. The legal community's blacklist had followed her everywhere, making it impossible to find work in her profession. As for the house, Lorraine had left behind a treasure trove of evidence regarding her crimes. Financial documents, jewelry purchased with stolen money, even a safe containing cash that had clearly been skimmed from charity donations. I decided to visit the house myself. Using my key, the one Richard had secretly made for me and left with Samuel, I entered my former home for the first time in over a decade. Lorraine's decorating had been predictably garish. She'd painted over my carefully chosen colors with harsh modern shades. She'd replaced my antique furniture with contemporary pieces that had no soul or history. She turned my cozy reading nook into a bar area. But walking through those rooms, I could see past her changes to the home I'd created. The crown molding I'd selected. The hardwood floors I'd insisted on. The built-in bookcases where I displayed our collection of first editions. In the master bedroom, the room I'd shared with Richard for 15 years, I found something that stopped me cold. Hidden in the back of the closet, behind Lorraine's expensive clothes, was a box containing photographs. Pictures of Richard and me from our early marriage. Photos of dinner parties we'd hosted. Images of holidays and vacations and quiet moments together. Richard had kept them all, hidden where Lorraine would never find them. At the bottom of the box was a handwritten note. Aaliyah, if you're reading this, then justice has finally been served. This house was always yours. I was just temporarily letting someone else live in it. I know I can't undo the pain I caused you, but I can make sure you end up where you belonged all along. Home. I love you. I never stopped loving you. I just forgot how to show it. Welcome home. Richard. I sat on the bed, where we'd slept together for 15 years, and cried. Not from sadness, but from a complex mix of grief, vindication, and something that might have been forgiveness. Richard had been a fool to leave me for Lorraine, but in the end, he'd found a way to undo at least part of the damage he'd caused. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking through the house, planning how I would restore it. Lorraine's gaudy decorating would be removed. My original design would be honored and improved. The garden would be replanted with the varieties I'd originally chosen. The house would be what it was always meant to be, my sanctuary, my reward for surviving betrayal and building a new life from nothing. That evening, I called Samuel to begin the process of officially taking possession. Samuel, I want to move forward with claiming the house. And I want to make sure Lorraine understands exactly what's happening. What do you have in mind? I want to be there when she comes to collect her belongings. I want her to see me in my house, where I belong. Samuel arranged for the property transfer and scheduled Lorraine's belongings removal for the following Saturday. She would be released from jail on bail that Friday and would have exactly 24 hours to clear out her personal items before the locks were changed. Saturday morning, I arrived at the house early. I'd brought coffee and pastries, and I settled into the living room to wait. Lorraine arrived at noon with a moving truck and 2 helpers. She looked haggard from her week in jail, and her usual polish was gone. When she saw my car in the driveway, her face twisted with rage. She stormed through the front door I'd selected and Richard had installed, and found me sitting calmly in the living room, drinking coffee from a china cup. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "I'm in my house," I replied pleasantly. "The question is, what are you doing here?" "This is my house. Richard left it to me." Actually, Richard transferred ownership to a trust 5 years ago. The trust's beneficiary is me. You've been living here at my pleasure, and that pleasure has now ended. I watched her face as the reality sank in. Everything she'd thought she'd won by stealing my husband, the house, the lifestyle, the security, had been an illusion. She'd never owned any of it. "That's impossible," the lawyers said. "The lawyers said you would inherit Richard's estate." The house was never part of his estate because he'd already given it to me. Lorraine looked around the room wildly, as if seeing it for the first time. "This can't be legal. I'll fight this." "With what money? Your assets are frozen due to your criminal charges. Your bail was paid by your brother, who's already said he won't help you with legal fees." The truth was brutal but necessary. Lorraine was powerless, just as I had been powerless when she destroyed my marriage. But unlike her, I'd rebuilt my life through strength and dignity rather than theft and cruelty. "You planned this," she whispered. "You orchestrated all of this." "I didn't make you steal from children's charities, Lorraine. I didn't make you have an affair with David Mitchell. I didn't make you raise children who became embezzlers and gambling addicts. You did all of that yourself." She started to respond, but I held up a hand to stop her. You have 4 hours to remove your personal belongings. The moving truck is waiting. I suggest you use your time efficiently. For the rest of the afternoon, I watched Lorraine pack up the life she'd stolen from me. Her expensive clothes, her gaudy decorations, her collection of jewelry purchased with embezzled money, all of it loaded into boxes and carried away. When she was finished, she stood in the doorway for a moment, looking back at the house that had never truly been hers. This won't bring him back, she said quietly. No, I agreed. But it brings me home. And that's enough. After she left, I walked through the empty rooms, planning their restoration. Soon, the house would be what it was always meant to be, a reflection of my taste, my values, my life. The old hag they'd mocked at the funeral was now the rightful owner of everything they'd thought they'd inherited. Justice, as it turned out, had a sense of irony. Moving back into my house should have been the end of my story. I had my home, my dignity, and the satisfaction of seeing Richard's corrupt family face consequences for their actions. But as I settled into the master bedroom that had once been my sanctuary, I realized that simple justice wasn't enough. They had humiliated me publicly, called me pathetic and desperate, mocked my grief at my ex-husband's funeral. Legal consequences and financial ruin were fitting punishments, but they were impersonal. I wanted them to understand, viscerally and personally, what they had done to me. I wanted them to feel what I had felt, helpless, alone, and afraid. The psychological campaign I designed was subtle, patient, and devastating. I would make them understand that their troubles weren't random misfortune. They were consequences deliberately delivered by the woman they'd underestimated. My first target was Brad, who was hiding in a motel 3 states away, working as a dishwasher and trying to avoid Torino's debt collectors. Clara surveillance had located him at the Sunset Motor Lodge outside Memphis, where he was living under the name Brian Grant and washing dishes at a truck stop diner for minimum wage. He looked haggard and constantly nervous, jumping at every unexpected sound.
Perfect.
I began with simple psychological pressure. Anonymous packages delivered to his motel room, each containing items that only someone with detailed knowledge of his situation would know to send. The first package contained a casino chip from his favorite illegal poker game in our city. No note, no explanation. Just the chip, which would make him wonder who knew where he was and what his connection to that game had been. The second package, delivered 3 days later, contained a photograph of his mother being led away in handcuffs. Again, no note. Just the image of Lorraine's arrest, which would remind him that his family's downfall was spreading and that he couldn't hide from it indefinitely. The third package was the most unsettling, a copy of a newspaper obituary for a gambling addict who'd been found dead after failing to pay his debts to loan sharks. The victim's name was circled in red, and someone had written, "Could be you," in the margin. Clara's surveillance showed that Brad was becoming increasingly paranoid. He'd moved to a different motel after the third package, but somehow the fourth package found him there anyway. This one contained a photograph of Johnny Torino, the loan shark he owed money to, along with a newspaper clipping about Torino's recent conviction for assault and battery. By the end of the second week, Brad was barely functioning. He'd lost his dishwashing job because he couldn't concentrate, and he was spending most of his time looking over his shoulder, convinced that Torino's people had found him. The beautiful irony was that Torino's organization had actually lost interest in Brad weeks ago. His debt was too small to justify the expense of tracking him across multiple states, especially since his mother's arrest had made it clear that no inheritance money was coming. They'd written off the debt as uncollectible and moved on to more profitable targets. But Brad didn't know that. The packages had convinced him that he was still being hunted, that his creditors were playing psychological games before closing in for collection. The final package contained only a mirror, a small compact mirror with a note that read, "Look who's pathetic now." Clara reported that Brad had another breakdown after receiving it, finally understanding that his torment wasn't coming from loan sharks or random coincidence. Someone was deliberately making him suffer, someone who knew exactly what would frighten him most. Meanwhile, I began a parallel campaign against Melissa, who was living with a friend and working at a call center under a false name. Melissa's greatest fear was professional exposure. She'd worked so hard to build her legal career, and losing it had devastated her sense of identity. She was desperately trying to reinvent herself in a new city, hoping that distance and time would allow her to start over. I made sure she understood that the past would follow her everywhere. My first contact with Melissa was indirect. I arranged for someone at her new workplace to receive an anonymous tip about her true identity. Not a malicious accusation, just information. You might want to know that your employee, Michelle Grant, is actually Melissa Gray, who was fired from a law firm for embezzlement. The call center, worried about liability, conducted a background check and discovered the truth. Melissa was fired the same day. She found another job within a week, telemarketing for a financial services company. I waited a month before making the next call. You should know that your employee, Michelle Grant, has a history of stealing money from client accounts. You might want to verify her background before giving her access to customer financial information. Fired again. The pattern continued for 3 months. Each time Melissa found employment, I would wait just long enough for her to feel secure before ensuring that her true identity was discovered. Never through direct accusations, always through concerned, anonymous tips that prompted employers to investigate on their own. By the 4th job loss, Melissa was beginning to understand that her troubles weren't coincidental. Someone was tracking her movements, learning about her employment, and systematically destroying her attempts to rebuild. The psychological impact was devastating. Every new job application became an exercise in anxiety. Every day at work was filled with the fear that this would be the day her past caught up with her again. I varied the timing to keep her off balance. Sometimes I would strike within days, sometimes I would wait months. The unpredictability was crucial. She could never feel safe, never assume that she'd successfully escaped her reputation. But the most effective psychological warfare was reserved for Lorraine herself. Lorraine had been released on bail pending trial, but her assets were frozen, and her social circle had abandoned her. She was living in a studio apartment, working as a cashier at a discount store, and trying to prepare for a criminal trial that would likely send her to prison for years. Her greatest fear wasn't prison, it was the loss of control and dignity that came with being reduced to nothing. My campaign against Lorraine was deeply personal. I began by visiting places where she was known to shop or spend time. Not to confront her, just to be seen. I would appear at the grocery store where she shopped, always looking elegant and composed, a reminder of everything she'd lost. I made sure to dress beautifully for these encounters, wearing the pearl jewelry that had become my signature and carrying myself with the dignity she'd tried to destroy at Richard's funeral. The psychological impact was immediate and obvious. Lorraine would see me and lose her composure, dropping items or hurrying away like someone being pursued. But the most devastating psychological blow came through the mail. I began sending Lorraine photographs, not recent ones, but images from her past. Photos of her with Richard during their marriage, but with my face carefully inserted in place of hers. The message was clear. I had reclaimed not just the house, but the entire life she'd thought she'd won by destroying my marriage. Each photograph came with a simple note. This is what it looks like when someone who deserves it gets to be happy. I also sent her copies of newspaper articles about her arrest and trial, but with certain phrases highlighted. Embezzlement from children's charity, affair with business partner, family destroyed by greed. The most psychologically devastating package contained a key to my house, our old house that she'd thought she was inheriting, along with a note that read, "Thank you for keeping my home warm while I was away. The real owner is back now." Clara's surveillance showed that these psychological campaigns were working exactly as intended. Brad had stopped eating regularly and was showing signs of severe anxiety and depression. He'd convinced himself that he was being hunted by forces beyond his understanding, and he was afraid to stay in any place for more than a few days. Melissa had stopped looking for legitimate employment and was working odd jobs under multiple fake names, convinced that any formal job would eventually be sabotaged by whoever was tracking her. Lorraine had become a shadow of her former self. The confident, manipulative woman who'd stolen my husband was now jumping at her own shadow, terrified of each day's mail delivery and constantly looking over her shoulder in public. They were all living in the psychological state I'd inhabited after Richard left me, uncertain, afraid, constantly waiting for the next blow to fall. But there was one crucial difference. My suffering had been undeserved. Theirs was justice. As I sat in my beautifully restored living room, sipping wine by the fireplace Richard and I had chosen together, I reflected on the elegance of psychological warfare. Physical violence was crude and temporary. Legal consequences were impersonal and distant. But psychological pressure, the constant knowledge that someone was watching, planning, remembering, that was permanent. They would carry the fear I'd given them for the rest of their lives, just as I'd carried the pain they'd given me. But I wasn't finished yet. The psychological campaign had been about making them understand their vulnerability. The next phase would be about making them turn on each other. After 3 months of individual psychological pressure, I began to plant evidence that suggested their troubles were coming from within their own family. I sent Brad a package containing a photocopy of a check his mother had written to herself from the children's charity, with a note that read, "Your mother had money to steal but none to help you with your debts. Interesting priorities." I sent Melissa a copy of a text message conversation between Lorraine and David Mitchell, discussing how ungrateful her children were and how they deserved whatever they got for their poor choices. The message suggested that Lorraine had known about their illegal activities, but had done nothing to help them avoid consequences. I sent Lorraine a fabricated email that appeared to be from Melissa, offering to testify against her mother in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The email detailed Melissa's willingness to describe how Lorraine had taught her to embezzle money and had encouraged her unethical behavior. Each family member received evidence suggesting that the others were betraying them, working with authorities, or actively contributing to their downfall. The results were spectacular. Brad called his mother for the first time since fleeing the city, screaming accusations about her abandoning him while she lived it up on stolen money. The conversation, which Clara managed to record through Brad's bugged motel room, ended with him threatening to tell everyone exactly what kind of mother Lorraine had been. Melissa confronted Lorraine about the supposed conversations with David Mitchell, demanding to know why her mother was throwing her children under the bus to protect her lover. Lorraine denied the conversations, but Melissa didn't believe her. Lorraine, convinced that Melissa was preparing to betray her in court, called her daughter a selfish, ungrateful bitch who had ruined the family with her stupid decisions. By the end of the month, they weren't speaking to each other at all. Each one was convinced that the others were actively working against them, contributing to their misery, or plotting additional betrayals. The family that had stood united in mocking me at Richard's funeral was now completely fractured, with each member isolated and paranoid about the others. But the most satisfying psychological victory came through a final, carefully orchestrated revelation. I arranged for each family member to receive the same package on the same day, a complete dossier of evidence showing exactly how their downfall had been orchestrated. The package contained copies of all the anonymous tips I'd made, recordings of the phone calls that had destroyed their jobs and relationships, and photographs of me conducting surveillance on each of them. The final item in each package was a letter, written in my own handwriting. Dear Brad, Melissa, Lorraine, you called me a pathetic old hag at Richard's funeral. You laughed at my grief and mocked my presence at the farewell service for a man I'd loved for 30 years. You thought I was powerless, defeated, finished. You thought age had made me weak and irrelevant. You were wrong. Every consequence you faced, every moment of fear and uncertainty, every loss and humiliation, I orchestrated all of it. Not through violence or crime, but through patience, intelligence, and the systematic use of your own weaknesses against you.
You destroyed yourselves.
I simply made sure the destruction was complete and that you understood who was responsible for your education and consequences. The old hag you mocked has systematically dismantled your lives, and you never saw it coming until it was too late to stop it. Welcome to powerlessness. Now you know how it feels. Sincerely, Aaliyah Gray. The woman who won. Clara's surveillance captured their reactions to receiving these packages. Brad threw a screaming fit in his motel room, destroying furniture and punching walls until his knuckles bled. The revelation that a 64-year-old woman had outsmarted him so completely was more than his ego could handle. Melissa sat in her car in the call center parking lot, reading and rereading the letter with tears streaming down her face. The systematic nature of her professional destruction finally made sense, and she understood that she would never be free of the consequences I'd set in motion. Lorraine collapsed on the floor of her studio apartment, sobbing uncontrollably as she realized that her entire downfall had been engineered by the woman she'd tried to humiliate. They all finally understood what they'd awakened when they mocked me at that funeral. The psychological warfare phase of my revenge was complete. They knew who had destroyed them, and they knew there was nothing they could do about it. Legal revenge could be appealed or overturned. Social consequences could be weathered or overcome. But psychological defeat was permanent. They would spend the rest of their lives knowing that a woman they dismissed as weak and pathetic had proven more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. As I read Clara's reports about their reactions, I felt a deep satisfaction settle into my bones. They had wanted to see me broken and defeated. Instead, they were broken and defeated while I sat in my restored home. The revelation of my orchestrated revenge had an effect I hadn't fully anticipated. It didn't just devastate them individually, it completely destroyed any remaining bonds between them. When cornered animals discover they've been systematically hunted, they often turn on each other in desperate attempts to survive. Richard's family proved no different. Within a week of receiving my confession letters, the psychological pressure I'd applied began to manifest as mutual destruction. Each family member, understanding that their downfall had been engineered rather than accidental, began looking for someone to blame other than themselves. Brad was the first to break. From his motel room in Memphis, he called Detective Harris at the Financial Crimes Unit and offered to provide information about his mother's criminal activities in exchange for protection from his creditors. "She's been stealing from charities for years," he told the detective, his voice recorded by the surveillance equipment Clara had placed in his room. "And she knew about my sister's embezzlement too. She taught us how to hide money, how to manipulate accounts. She's the real criminal here." Brad's desperation to shift blame led him to fabricate details about Lorraine's crimes, making her seem like a criminal mastermind who had corrupted her innocent children. He described elaborate schemes that existed only in his imagination, painted himself as a victim of his mother's influence, and provided evidence that was mostly lies mixed with enough truth to sound convincing. The detective, already building a strong case against Lorraine, was interested in Brad's testimony. The prosecution loved cooperating witnesses, especially family members willing to testify against each other. Melissa, learning about her brother's cooperation through her criminal defense attorney, decided that attack was the best defense. She contacted the same detective and offered her own version of events, one that painted both her mother and brother as the primary criminals while positioning herself as a reluctant participant who'd been pressured into illegal activities. "My mother controlled all the family finances," Melissa lied smoothly, her legal training evident in how she structured her false narrative. She told me that skimming client settlements was normal practice, that all lawyers did it. When I questioned her, she threatened to cut me off from the family if I didn't comply. Melissa's story made Lorraine seem like a manipulative matriarch who had forced her children into crime, while Brad was portrayed as an unstable gambling addict who couldn't be trusted to tell the truth about anything. Both siblings were essentially racing to see who could betray their mother more completely in exchange for reduced charges. Lorraine, learning about her children's cooperation through her attorney, felt the final betrayal that broke her completely. The woman who had once been confident enough to publicly humiliate me at a funeral was now sitting in her studio apartment, sobbing as she realized that the children she'd raised and protected were willing to destroy her to save themselves. But Lorraine's response wasn't surrender. It was revenge. If her children wanted to play the betrayal game, she would show them how it was really done. Lorraine contacted her attorney and authorized him to provide the prosecution with evidence about her children's crimes that went far beyond what either Brad or Melissa had admitted to. She revealed that Melissa's embezzlement had started in law school, where she'd stolen money from the Student Legal Aid Fund. She provided bank records showing that Brad's gambling debts were even larger than investigators knew, and that he'd threatened violence against elderly clients when he'd worked briefly at Richard's company. But most devastatingly, she revealed that both children had known about her charity embezzlement and had actively helped her conceal it. They weren't victims, Lorraine told the prosecutor in a recorded statement. They were my partners. Melissa helped me create the shell accounts for hiding money, and Brad helped me forge documentation when donations needed to be reported to the IRS. The prosecution now had 3 family members, each claiming to be the victim of the others, each providing evidence of crimes beyond what had originally been discovered. The beautiful irony was that they were all telling the truth about each other while lying about themselves. Their mutual betrayals were revealing the full scope of their criminal activities. Crimes that might have remained hidden if they'd simply accepted their punishments with dignity. But dignity had never been their strong suit. The family's public destruction accelerated as news of their mutual betrayals leaked to the media. Local newspapers began covering the story of the Gray family crime syndicate, as one particularly creative headline writer dubbed them. The coverage was devastating to what remained of their reputations. They weren't just criminals. They were criminals who had betrayed each other in the most public way possible. Even other criminals looked down on family members who testified against each other. Brad, reading about his family's mutual betrayals online, had what Clara described as a complete psychological breakdown. He called his sister screaming that she was a lying bitch who was destroying the family to save herself. Melissa responded by calling their mother and threatening to reveal everything about Lorraine's affair with David Mitchell if she didn't stop cooperating with prosecutors. Lorraine, pushed beyond her breaking point, made the final move that destroyed any possibility of family reconciliation. She called a press conference. Standing outside the courthouse where her criminal trial was scheduled to begin, Lorraine Gray addressed a crowd of reporters and television cameras with the poise of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I want to tell the truth about my family," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "My children have painted me as a criminal mastermind who corrupted them. But the truth is that they were stealing and lying long before I ever took money from any charity." She detailed Melissa's embezzlement at her law firm, Brad's gambling addiction and threats of violence, and their enthusiastic participation in her own criminal activities. But then she dropped the bombshell that destroyed any remaining sympathy for the family. "My children are now claiming they were innocent victims of my influence. But they're forgetting something important. I have recordings of our conversations. Recordings where they bragged about their crimes, planned new ways to steal money, and laughed about the people they were hurting." Lorraine's attorney had advised against the press conference, but she'd insisted. She wanted the world to know that if she was going down, she wasn't going down alone. The recordings she released to the media were devastating. Hours of conversations where all three family members discussed their crimes casually, joked about their victims, and planned elaborate schemes to avoid detection. The most damaging recording was from 6 months before Richard's death, where all three could be heard laughing about that pathetic old woman, meaning me, and discussing how much money they would inherit when Richard died. "The old hag thinks she still matters," Melissa's voice said clearly on the recording. "Dad should have her banned from the funeral when the time comes." "Why wait?" Brad's voice responded. "We should make sure everyone knows she's just a desperate ex-wife who can't let go." Lorraine's voice joined in. "Don't worry. When Richard dies, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what I think of his first wife. She'll regret showing her face in public." The recordings provided clear evidence that they had planned to humiliate me at Richard's funeral, that their cruelty had been premeditated rather than spontaneous. But more importantly for their legal situations, the recordings contained detailed admissions of guilt for crimes that prosecutors hadn't even discovered yet. By the end of that week, all three family members were facing additional charges based on their own recorded admissions. Their mutual betrayals had not only destroyed their family bonds, they had actually increased their legal jeopardy. The prosecution, armed with hours of recorded confessions and three witnesses willing to testify against each other, had built an airtight case against all of them. As I watched the news coverage of their press conference and the release of the recordings, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal revenge. They had mocked me for being alone, for having no family support after Richard's death. But their family unity had been an illusion built on shared criminality and mutual enabling. When pressure was applied, their family bonds had shattered like glass, revealing that their unity had been based on convenience rather than love. I, who they had called a lonely old woman, was surrounded by genuine relationships with people who respected and cared for me. They, who had mocked my isolation, were now truly alone, abandoned by each other in the most public and humiliating way possible. The family that had stood together to humiliate me at Richard's funeral was now completely destroyed, with each member working actively to ensure the other's punishment and disgrace. Justice, I reflected, had a sense of poetry. The final arrests came on a cold Tuesday morning in November, exactly 6 months after Richard's funeral. I watched from my living room window as unmarked police cars pulled up to the courthouse where Lorraine was scheduled for a pretrial hearing. Detective Harris had called me the night before to let me know that the additional charges based on the family's recorded confessions had been finalized. All three family members would be arrested simultaneously at locations across the country, a coordinated operation designed to prevent any of them from fleeing or destroying additional evidence. "Mrs. Gray," Detective Harris had said, "I want you to know that your information and cooperation were instrumental in building these cases. Without your initial report about the charity embezzlement, we might never have discovered the full scope of their criminal activities." I thanked him politely, not mentioning that my cooperation had been motivated by something far more personal than civic duty. Now, watching the police cars converge on the courthouse, I felt a profound sense of completion. This was the final act of a play that had begun with my humiliation at Richard's funeral. Clara called me with updates as the arrests proceeded. "Brad was taken into custody at a truck stop in Arkansas," she reported. "He was washing dishes in the kitchen when federal marshals walked in. Apparently, he tried to run but tripped over a mop bucket and fell face-first into a stack of dirty plates." Even in his final moment of freedom, Brad had managed to be pathetic. Melissa was arrested at her call center job in Phoenix. She was on the phone with a customer when the FBI walked up to her desk. They let her finish the call before cuffing her. Professional courtesy, I suppose. Melissa's arrest had been witnessed by her coworkers, adding public humiliation to her legal troubles. She'd been working under the name Michelle Grant, but everyone would now know her true identity and criminal history. "And Lorraine?" I asked. "She's being processed now." She actually seemed relieved when they arrested her. "I think the psychological pressure of the past 6 months finally broke her completely. I could understand that. Living with the knowledge that your life was being systematically destroyed by someone you'd underestimated would be exhausting. Prison, at least, offered the certainty of defined consequences. The charges were extensive and devastating. Brad faced federal charges for wire fraud related to his embezzlement at Richard's company, crimes that had only been discovered through Lorraine's revelations. State charges for threatening elderly clients, and additional federal charges for crossing state lines to avoid creditors. His total potential sentence was 15 to 20 years. Melissa faced federal charges for embezzlement at her law firm, state charges for fraud related to her charity board activities, and federal charges for tax evasion related to unreported income from her crimes. As a lawyer, her sentences would be enhanced due to her professional ethical violations. She was looking at 12 to 18 years. Lorraine faced the most serious charges: federal charges for charity fraud, state charges for embezzlement, federal charges for money laundering, and additional charges related to the criminal conspiracy with her children. Her recorded admissions had made conviction almost certain, and she was facing 25 years to life. All three would likely die in prison, given their ages and the length of their sentences. The media coverage was extensive and brutal. The Gray family crime syndicate had become a cautionary tale about greed, corruption, and family dysfunction. Every major newspaper in the region covered their arrests, often accompanied by unflattering photographs from their previous court appearances. But the coverage that satisfied me most was a feature article in the Sunday magazine section titled, "The Real Victims of the Gray Family Crimes." The article focused on the elderly people whose charity donations had been stolen, the legal clients whose settlement money had been embezzled, and the children's programs that had been defunded due to missing charitable contributions. One interview particularly caught my attention. Mrs. Dorothy Patterson, 79, lost her life savings when Brad Gray embezzled her investment account while working at his stepfather's company. "I trusted him because he seemed like such a nice young man," Mrs. Patterson said. "His family seemed so respectable." You never think people like that would steal from an old woman. The article made it clear that the Gray family's victims were real people who had suffered real consequences from their crimes. These weren't victimless financial crimes. They were calculated thefts from vulnerable people who had trusted the wrong family. Reading about the actual victims reminded me that my revenge, satisfying as it was, had also served a larger purpose. By exposing the Gray family's crimes, I had helped protect future victims and ensured that dangerous criminals were removed from society. The final court proceedings were swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence and their own recorded confessions, all three family members pleaded guilty to avoid even harsher sentences. I attended each sentencing hearing, sitting in the gallery wearing my pearls and watching as the people who had mocked me received their final punishments. Brad's sentencing was almost anticlimactic. He stood before the judge looking hollow and defeated, mumbling an apology that sounded more like self-pity than genuine remorse. "Your Honor," he said, his voice barely audible, "I know I made mistakes. I got in over my head with gambling, and I made poor decisions trying to fix my problems. I accept responsibility for my actions." The judge was not impressed by his lack of genuine accountability. "Mr. Gray, your crimes weren't mistakes. They were calculated thefts from people who trusted you. You stole from elderly clients, threatened vulnerable people, and showed no remorse until you were caught. This court sentences you to 18 years in federal prison." Brad's knees buckled as the sentence was read. 18 years meant he would be nearly 50 when released, assuming he served his full sentence. His youth, his health, his potential, all of it would be lost to the federal prison system. Melissa's sentencing was more dramatic. She maintained her composure until the moment the judge announced her sentence, then broke down completely. 15 years in federal prison, the judge said firmly. "As an attorney, you held a position of special trust in our society. Your betrayal of that trust, your theft from clients who depended on you, and your participation in a family conspiracy to defraud charitable organizations represent some of the most serious ethical violations this court has seen. Melissa sobbed openly as she was led away in handcuffs. The successful lawyer, who had given touching eulogies about second chances, was now facing 15 years to contemplate the consequences of her own choices. But Lorraine's sentencing was the most satisfying of all. She stood before the judge with dignity, her head high despite the shackles on her wrists. Even facing decades in prison, she maintained the poise that had once made her confident enough to humiliate me publicly. Mrs. Gray, the judge said, reviewing the extensive case file, your crimes are particularly heinous because they involved stealing money meant to help children in need. You held positions of trust in multiple charitable organizations, and you systematically abused that trust to fund a lifestyle of luxury, while children went without necessary services. The judge paused, letting the weight of Lorraine's crimes settle over the courtroom. Furthermore, your recorded statements make it clear that you felt no remorse for your victims and that you actively encouraged your children to participate in criminal activities. This court sentences you to 28 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. 28 years. Lorraine was 58 years old, which meant she would be 86 if she lived to complete her sentence. She would spend the rest of her life in prison, paying for the crimes she had committed and the cruelty she had shown to others. As she was led away, Lorraine looked directly at me for the first time since Richard's funeral. Our eyes met across the courtroom, and I saw not hatred or defiance, but something that might have been understanding. She finally realized who I was and what I was capable of. She understood that the woman she had mocked as a pathetic old hag had orchestrated her complete destruction with patience, intelligence, and unwavering determination. I nodded slightly in acknowledgement, a gesture that said everything that needed to be said. You chose to make me your enemy. This is what happens when you choose poorly. After the sentencing, I walked out of the courthouse into the bright November sunshine. The autumn air was crisp and clean, and I felt lighter than I had in months. Detective Harris was waiting by my car. Justice served, he said simply. Yes, I agreed. Justice served. As I drove home to my beautiful house, the house that was finally, truly mine, I reflected on the journey from that terrible day at Richard's funeral to this moment of complete vindication. They had mocked me for being old, dismissed me as powerless, and humiliated me in front of a room full of people who had once respected me. But age had given me patience, experience had given me wisdom, and their cruelty had given me the motivation to use both against them with devastating effectiveness. The old hag they had laughed at was driving home to a mansion, while they were beginning decades-long prison sentences. Sometimes, the universe has a sense of humor after all. 1 year after Richard's funeral, I hosted a dinner party in my restored home. The guest list included Samuel Kane, Detective Harris, Clara Moore, and several friends who had supported me through the difficult months of my campaign for justice. The house looked magnificent. I'd spent months returning it to its original beauty, erasing every trace of Lorraine's gaudy renovations and restoring the elegant simplicity I'd originally designed. The rooms once again reflected my taste, my values, my sense of harmony and grace. As my guests enjoyed wine and conversation in the living room where Richard and I had once entertained together, I felt a profound sense of completion. This wasn't just a dinner party. It was a celebration of justice served and a life reclaimed. To Aaliyah, Samuel raised his glass during dinner, who proved that patience and intelligence are more powerful than youth and cruelty. The toast was echoed around the table, and I felt genuinely moved by the respect and affection in their voices. These people, some old friends, some new allies, valued me for who I was, not for what I could do for them. After the guests left, I sat alone in my living room with a glass of wine, reflecting on the extraordinary year behind me. Brad Gray was serving his 18-year sentence in a federal prison in Kentucky. According to Clara's occasional updates, he'd aged rapidly in prison and spent most of his time in protective custody due to threats from other inmates who didn't appreciate criminals who stole from elderly people. Melissa Gray was imprisoned in a women's federal facility in Texas. She'd lost her law license permanently and spent her days working in the prison laundry for 23 cents an hour, a dramatic reduction from her former salary as a junior partner. Lorraine Gray was serving her 28-year sentence in a maximum security prison in Ohio. At nearly 60, she was considered an elderly inmate and spent most of her time in isolation for her own protection. The woman who had once commanded attention and respect was now just another aging prisoner counting down the years until her inevitable death behind bars. None of them would ever be free again. None of them would ever have the opportunity to hurt innocent people the way they had hurt me and so many others. But perhaps more importantly, they would spend every remaining day of their lives knowing that their destruction had been orchestrated by the woman they had dismissed as powerless. I'd kept copies of all the newspaper coverage of their trials and convictions. Occasionally, I would read through the articles, remembering the satisfaction of watching their arrogant confidence crumble as they realized the scope of their legal jeopardy. The house itself had become my greatest trophy. Every room told the story of my victory over the people who had tried to erase me from my own history. The kitchen where I now cooked meals in peace. The master bedroom where I slept soundly without fear or anxiety. The garden where I spent afternoons reading, surrounded by the roses Richard had planted for me decades ago. This house had been built with love, stolen through betrayal, and reclaimed through justice. It was more than a home. It was proof that patience and intelligence could overcome any obstacle. I'd also received an unexpected gift from Richard's final arrangements. His private safe, opened only after all legal proceedings were complete, contained letters he'd written over the years but never sent. Letters to me, expressing regret for his choices, admiration for my strength, and love that had never really died despite his cruel departure. Reading those letters, I felt something I hadn't expected: forgiveness. Not for the pain he'd caused me, but for the man he'd been when we were young and in love. Richard had made terrible choices in his midlife crisis, but his final actions had shown that he'd never stopped understanding what he'd lost when he'd lost me. The financial settlement from Richard's estate, combined with the value of the house and my own careful investments over the years, had left me quite wealthy. Not billionaire wealthy, but comfortable enough to live exactly as I chose for the rest of my life. I'd also received something more valuable than money: respect. The story of how I'd exposed the Gray family's crimes had spread through our social circles, and I was now seen as someone who had shown remarkable courage and intelligence in difficult circumstances. People who had whispered about my divorce and felt sorry for the abandoned wife now looked at me with admiration. I was no longer defined by what Richard had done to me, but by what I had accomplished in response. Most evenings, I would sit on my terrace as the sun set, sipping wine and reading while classical music played softly in the background. The peace I felt was profound, not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of genuine contentment. I thought often about the words Lorraine had spoken at Richard's funeral. "What is this old hag doing here?" The old hag, as it turned out, had been collecting her inheritance. Not money or property, but something far more valuable: the satisfaction of justice perfectly served. I'd learned that age wasn't weakness, it was patience refined by experience. I'd discovered that being underestimated was an advantage rather than an insult. I'd proven that intelligence and determination could overcome youth and arrogance every single time. The woman who had mocked me for being old and alone was now spending her remaining years in prison, surrounded by criminals and counting down the days until her death. The woman she had mocked was living in luxury, surrounded by people who genuinely cared for her, enjoying every day of her freedom. Some stories have happy endings for everyone involved. Others have happy endings only for those who deserve them. Mine was decidedly the latter type. On quiet evenings like this, I would sometimes imagine Lorraine in her prison cell, perhaps looking out through barred windows at the world she would never rejoin. I wondered if she ever thought about the funeral where she'd made the worst mistake of her life, not just humiliating me, but revealing to me exactly what kind of people she and her children really were. If she did think about that day, I hoped she understood the lesson I'd tried to teach her. Some people are more dangerous than they appear, and cruelty always comes with a price. The old hag they'd mocked at the funeral had become the architect of their destruction, the author of their downfall, and the final judge of their fate. I raised my wine glass in a silent toast to the empty terrace, acknowledging the ghosts of everyone who had underestimated me over the years. To patience, I said quietly, to justice, and to the beautiful silence that comes when your enemies can no longer hurt anyone. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, and I sat in perfect peace, knowing that I had reclaimed not just my home and my dignity, but my power to shape my own destiny. Some women my age spent their golden years regretting the past or fearing the future. I spent mine enjoying the present I had created through strength, intelligence, and the unwavering belief that everyone eventually gets exactly what they deserve. The old hag had won, and the victory was sweeter than anything I could have imagined. If this story has shown you anything, it's that your age, your circumstances, your past, none of that defines your power. Aaliyah proved that wisdom, patience, and strategic thinking can overcome any obstacle. You have more strength than you know, more capability than anyone has told you, and more potential than you've ever imagined. Our book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, will show you how to transform every setback into a comeback, every wound into wisdom, and every ending into a new beginning. Click the link below and start writing the chapter of your life where you finally win. Because just like Aaliyah, your greatest victories are still ahead of you.